Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you here today to view our special presentation of From Europe to the Pacific, the Maine National Guard in World War II. A big thank you to the Maine Humanities Council, whose generous grant funded this evening's presentation and one more, which we'll be showing in the future. Special thanks also to Captain Jonathan Bratten, Maine National Guard historian, who so graciously agreed to share these stories with us today and bring to life the struggles and stories of Maine soldiers during World War II. This is his second presentation for Vet to Vet Maine, and we are very grateful to him. Major General Bill Libby, Vet to Vet Maine board member, who first introduced us to Captain Bratten, and the University of New England, which wrote the grant and helped set up this evening's event. With special thanks to Dr. Tom Muser, founding director of UNE's Center for Excellence in Aging and Health, and noted historian in his own right. Dr. Muser will be commenting on tonight's presentation and leading the discussion that follows. I am Susan Gold, Executive Director of Vet to Vet Maine. We match veteran peer companions to other veterans who need a friend. If you are interested in joining our effort to ease social isolation among veterans, please visit our website at www.vet2vetmaine.org. Now let's hear Jonathan Bratten's fascinating stories about the members of Maine National Guard in World War II. Jonathan, thank you.
As December rolls around, things are looking like they are going to sort of wind down as they're coming up to 1 year of federal service in February. And of course, December 7th happens. Leaves and furloughs were all canceled. Married men with dependents were discharged, and everything changed. The first thing that happens early in 1942 is that the 43rd moves to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and undergoes a transformation. It goes from four infantry regiments down to 3. And the field artillery is broken up into independent battalions. The division now shrinks down to about 15,000 troops to make it more manageable in combat. What this basically means now is that the Maine folks are beginning to separate. There's no change in the 103rd Infantry, but dramatic changes to the 152nd Field Artillery. The 1st Battalion, the County Boys, are completely removed from the division and become the 203rd Field Artillery Battalion. More on them later. The 2nd Battalion from Bangor becomes the 152nd Field Artillery Battalion, just to confuse all of us. I swear that's the only reason they begin these name changes like that. They're teamed up with the 103rd Infantry to form what was called the 103rd Regimental Combat Team. They would also be supplemented with engineers from the division's engineer battalion. The idea being that this regimental combat team can fight exclusively without the division, but having one battery of artillery for every battalion of infantry, and so they can sort of be self-sustaining for a little bit. After some additional training, they moved to Fort Ord, California, and their first stop is in New Zealand. They disembark there in October 23rd, 1942 in Auckland, as a local band played the Maine Stein Song, which was incidentally also the regimental march. The division was here to protect the islands and Australia from any attempted push by the Japanese to down into to New Zealand and on Australia, since so many of the Commonwealth troops were now fighting elsewhere in Asia, mainly up through Burma and China. 1 month later in November, the division then moved to New Caledonia, just offshore. And there they continued to train up through early 1943, really specializing in amphibious landings. So in this photo here, you've got all the governors of the New England states. You've got governor, that's Sumner Sewell in the white hat, third from the right. He was the governor of Maine at the time. He was also a World War I fighter ace. So you can imagine that, being governor of Maine and also saying, well, I've shot down 7 German aircraft. What have you done? Sort of a nice bragging, right? You also have the panoramic view of the 103rd Infantry area. And I got to tell you what, I mobilized out of Camp Shelby in 2013 for Afghanistan. And yeah, I couldn't wait to leave there to go to Afghanistan. And also, it hasn't changed at all. I'm pretty sure those are the same buildings too. Some things just stay the same. So this is a good time to sort of describe the war in the Pacific at this point. You've got two campaigns that are be going through the Central Pacific and then the Southern Pacific. And we're going to be focusing on the Southern Pacific, which is the push led by General Douglas MacArthur. You have this beginning at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands down on the bottom. And then this is going to go through New Guinea. And then once New Guinea is sort of past, I mean, New Guinea is basically a scene of fighting from like 1942 to 1945. I don't think there's any time when, and basically everybody rotates through New Guinea at some point. And then it's the push to retake the Philippines and then on to the Japanese home islands. But this is essentially the island hopping campaign to retake all of this that has been lost in 1941 and the final days of 1941, and then in 1942. The Solomons are that stepping stone there towards larger islands which are close to Japan. It is a very, very different war from the war in Europe, and one that the U.S. Army had never really looked at before. We always look at the Pacific as a primarily Navy theater, primarily Marine Corps. There were 23 Army divisions in the Pacific. There were 9 Marine Corps divisions total. So this is very much an Army theater as well. The 103rd is going to get its baptism of fire, landing on Guadalcanal in February of 1943. The battle is pretty much over. The only thing that's happening is that the Japanese aircraft are continuing to strike the island, dropping bombs. And so they take fire for the first time on February 17th, 1943, in a Japanese air raid. They will then move further up the Russell Islands, making their first amphibious landing at the Russell Islands, which were mercifully unopposed because the landings were, they were rookies, so a little sloppy. But because the Japanese had evacuated the islands, they sort of got a chance for a dry run. With the Russell Islands in hand, the next set of islands were the New Georgia Islands. And for these, I had never heard of the islands of New Georgia until I began studying the Maine National Guard. And unless you were a veteran of the 43rd Division or the 37th Infantry Division from the Ohio National Guard, you probably would have never heard of this tiny little area of land. But for veterans of those two divisions, New Georgia and the name of Munda and Munda Airfield is forever burned in their collective memory as just a horrible, horrible place. This is the baptism of fire. This is really where the division, both divisions were sort of forged. And for me personally, I actually was, I started out in the Ohio National Guard in the 145th Armor, which traces its lineage to one of the elements of the 37th Division. So I kind of feel like it's a little bit of my own personal history blended in here. The reason for taking New Georgia was the airfield, the Japanese airfield on Munda Point, reducing the fortifications on the island and clearing it for the next step towards La Vella and then Bougainville up north. This was a very joint operation: Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Army Air Corps, naval aircraft, all working together. The first landings are June 30th of 1943. The 103rd Regimental Combat Team conducted 2 initial landings to get support beachheads on the island, alongside Marine Raider detachments, one landing there at Segi Point, the other at Viru Harbor. The overall objective was Munda Point in the airfield there. The island of Rendova, sort of in the very center, is where one of the other battalions landed to secure that. That became the firing position for the 152nd Field Artillery as well, where their guns could reach across and strike targets over on New Georgia. There were approximately 10,000 Japanese in the area, lots of enemy aircraft, heavily dug into jungle positions using coconut logs and the essence of the jungle, I guess is the best way to say it, to disguise themselves and really use the jungle to fight back against the American invaders. The introduction to combat was tough and unforgiving. Um, this is a Japanese barge. It was one night, Company G from Waterville. It was on the night of June 30th. They had literally, their first day landed. That night they were in their position and two Japanese barges full of reinforcements were trying to land. Waterville's Company G then opened up with machine guns, automatic rifles, grenades, tore into the barges, leaving no survivors left alive. A very fierce, rude awakening for these troops on the brutality of war. Fighting in the jungles is just a different thing entirely. Half the time you were actually fighting the jungle itself, the men usually wrote. You were fighting the enemy, you were fighting the insects, you were fighting the constant moisture, the monsoon rains, and then the blazing sun. Uniforms literally rotted off them in a matter of weeks. You will note that some of the men are wearing camouflage uniforms. This was something that the US Army was doing at the time. They eventually did away with it. I don't know why. I will do more research on that later. But most of these actions were small unit based. But the jungle, especially at night, was a terrifying thing for troops that had not seen combat before. Japanese tactics basically played off of this. And so you have a situation, this is really seen in the 169th Infantry from Connecticut. The 172nd and the 103rd Infantry regiments, both from Maine and Vermont, tended to be individuals who mostly had, were really comfortable living in the outdoors, really comfortable in being out in nature and hearing all the noises all the time. The 169 had a real problem when it first went into the line. So what would happen is the units would advance. They would be in combat during the day. They would dig in at night, and they would sort of pull security with two people to a foxhole. Now, a lot of the Japanese tactics involved psychological warfare. So they would listen for a while, listen to the conversations. They would get their American speakers out there. And then they would call out, calling people out by name, by family, by location, even some of them calling out details that they'd read in newspapers about the Louisiana maneuvers, just to throw guys off even more. This is very disconcerting stuff to hear at night from the jungle, especially if you're exhausted and you've been up for about 48 hours. They would also do things like if there were two guards who were asleep in a foxhole, they would kill one, leave the other alive. These incidents were rare, but they happened enough that guys began to really lose it. They would wake up in the middle of the night. They would go to sleep with their arms linked together, arm in arm, one with a pistol in his hand, one with a knife, something like that. And someone would wake up, they'd hear a noise, and they just wake up shooting, and they might shoot the guy in the next foxhole, or in the foxhole with them, or they might slash him with a knife. After a couple days, this began to develop into what we would now call, I don't even we would call it PTSD. At the time, it was called war neurosis. But the 169th and then to a lesser extent, the 172nd, both developed massive cases of neuropsychiatric casualties, guys who kind of had a face that looked like the guy who's leading this column. So this is a picture of troops from Company C from Norway. So this is actually my company that I command today. The sort of blank look staring off in the distance. The 43rd Division, as a result of the New Georgia campaign, developed the highest cases of neuropsychiatric casualties in any one division in the entire war. And being 1943, no one was really sure quite what to do about this. They didn't know if they just sort of, do we send them home? Do we give them sort of treatment? Do we, how do we treat this? Eventually, they found that the best way to defeat this was, if there were guys who were just literally at their limits, pull them off the front lines, give them a spot where they can they can shower or have a shower or a bath and a clean bed and a couple nights sleep. And that pretty much did it. The other thing was victory. Once they had found out that the Japanese soldier was not this boogeyman that they thought, this super soldier, it was just a normal person, victory began to reverse this. But I think these images are just very striking because we see individuals who are really in the crucible, as it were. On July 14th, after 2 weeks of fighting, the 103rd is beginning to be fully committed to the fight on the drive towards Munda. We are looking, we're looking at a front of, they really are looking at 2,000 yards, about 4,000 yards from Leona Beach to Munda Airfield. And this is going to take the better part of 2 weeks to make this drive. The 3rd Battalion lands at Leona on 14 July. A week later, on July 22nd, the 2nd Battalion lands, and they begin fighting shoulder to shoulder towards Munda Airfield, driving hard through successive lines of enemy defenses, very dug in. They begin using tanks, artillery, and infantry in concert, as well as infantry armed with flamethrowers to root out Japanese strong points. A few individuals to note as we go through this. Harold Slager of the 152nd Field Artillery from Bangor. The Japanese actually landed a patrol on Rendova Island to try to knock out the division command post. Slager was basically a forward observer for the artillery. And he was in his observation post and he noticed a large gathering of Japanese forces. He remained in his position, radioing that information back to the Rendova command post, so that way they could respond to the attack. And because he remained in position, he was found by the Japanese, who was killed in action. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Great photo, one of my favorite photos. The guns of the 152nd Field Artillery providing fire support deep in the jungle from locations on the several islands. Really, one of the most remarkable things that New Georgia did for these troops was cause them to think in innovative ways of how to fight. I mean, jungle fighting is almost like urban fighting. Like you can't rely on seeing what's around you. You don't know what's near, so you have to think innovatively. So they realized that when they would begin firing artillery barrages, the Japanese would actually move forward out of their positions to hug the American lines because they knew they'd be safer there. They knew when the artillery stopped to run back to their positions. So getting wise to this, the artillery would initiate a barrage on Japanese positions. The U.S. infantry would pull back, and then the Japanese would go up and hug the old American positions. Then the artillery would shift to strike where the Americans had been. So this tactical innovation is showing that these soldiers are really learning how to make war in these types of conditions. It was a casualty-heavy operation. From your point of injury on the island, you would probably be carried back to a company aid station, then a battalion aid station, all on a litter or helped by your buddies. From there, a Jeep would carry you over the rutted, rocky, muddy roads of the island, jarring you to one of the beaches, where you would be piled into a landing craft like this with a whole bunch of other wounded, and then brought out to a ship. You'd be brought up the side, and if usually a destroyer would ferry you to a hospital in the rear area or to another hospital ship. So just because you are being evacuated doesn't mean that your troubles are over. It's one of these differences of making war in an amphibious environment that is just so very different from what we're used to. Few photos here. You have Sergeant Levesque and Private Whitman there on the right, or I'm sorry, on the left. A great shot of reading a letter from home. Private Whitman would actually be killed in action on Luzon about 2 years later. And then you have Omar Pomerleau from Skowhegan, a formerly high school football star on the Skowhegan football team in Company L, killed in action by a sniper. Heavy losses all around, a lot of letters heading back home to Maine families. On August 5th, finally, the 3rd Battalion broke through the final line at Munda and took Munda Airfield. This is a photo of a bunch of the guys from the battalion who are in a bomb crater. It was a US bomb that was dropped, so pausing for a photo. I love this one because you got to love the beards. These are guys who have been in combat for a while. It's a great photo because these are no longer untried rookies. These are combat veterans. They know how to survive, and they're going to teach those around them how to survive as well. And so from August 5th, there's some continued fighting on some of the smaller islands, patrols going to root out enemy strong points, but they go into a rest period on New Georgia after this. And then from there, they move back to New Zealand for some real R&R and to get replacements. And then in 1944, they moved to New Georgia. New Guinea. Not a lot going on in New Guinea for them other than continued patrols, holding the line. This photo of the 152nd Field Artillery firing again. I just want you to note the contrast. Everything is so clean. Everything is clean. The guns are clean. The men are clean. They're wearing their spats. That's a clear sign of a rear area true soldier, is that you're actually wearing those doggone things on your legs. Most combat veterans sort of eschewed those as soon as they got out into the lines. On Christmas Day, 1944, the men of all elements loaded onto transports in New Guinea and made the trip to Lingayen Gulf off the island of Luzon, Luzon being the largest of the Philippine Islands. Now, Philippine Islands fell in 1942, scenes of massive American embarrassment, a disaster, the largest surrender of U.S. forces in American history. You have MacArthur's famous "I shall return." I won't add any commentary on that, but just know that he was not well esteemed by many of the guys who were going to land at Lingayen Gulf in 45. But be that as it may, he was intent on seizing the Philippines again, liberating them, and this was one more step towards the Japanese home islands. January 9th, 1945 was D-Day. And I'm going to leave Second Lieutenant Edward Ho of Charlie Company of the 103rd to describe what that day was like. Quote, "We all got in the boats and we went through the big battleships in the back and they were firing. And we went through the cruisers and they were firing. And then we went through the destroyers and they were firing. And then we went through this, and then they had those things that shot like rockets through those. And then we got closer and the machine guns were firing." So as he describes, massive preparatory bombardment on the Lingayen Gulf area. As it turned out, they need not have done that. The Japanese realized that fighting on the beach was going to really lose them a lot of troops. And so they elected to make the Allies pay for the high ground instead. The 103rd RCT landed at White Beach 3 on D-Day. Massive push of 130,000 troops landing at Lingayen Gulf. As Sergeant Jay Gruenfeld of Love Company of the 103rd wrote afterwards, "The Amtrak ground to shore and let down its ramp on White Beach 3 adjacent to the town of San Fabian. It was 0940. We clambered off and instantly sank into the fine sand. I was in the best shape of my life, yet the 70-pound load I was carrying made it difficult to move forward. I had 4 bandoliers of ammunition, plus a clip in my rifle, 3 or 4 grenades, 3 days worth of K rations, water-filled canteens, a bazooka shell which weighed several pounds, and a couple 60-millimeter mortar rounds. Hill 200 would be our company's first objective, and we passed through San Fabian's rubble and started down the San Jacinto Road in order to get there. As they began to push inland, opposition stiffened as the ground rose, and they were subjected to artillery and mortar fire as they moved in." This is a scene of the terrain, no longer the jungles that they'd been fighting in. They actually wrote that they had to retrain for warfare in the open. And fighting on Luzon would be characterized by fighting in rice paddies, such as these rivers dividing the rice paddies on the advance inland, and then mountainous terrain. Their first opposition was Hill 200, a commanding landmass, although as one veteran wrote, we soon realized that on Luzon, there were no landmasses that were not commanding. Uh, this took 5 days of pounding with artillery, mortars, and then infantry action with flamethrowers to finally subdue Hill 200. Moving further on, they then hit their next commanding elevation, Hill 600. These are named for the elevation of the hill. So the hill is 600 meters high. A massive height full of Japanese tunnels, trenches. The fighting for Hill 600 took the better part of 2 weeks. They took it in stages, working their way up. These are mortars from Company H of Waterville, working over Hill 600. On January 22nd, the 3rd Battalion was holding a commander's meeting with all their company commanders. Foolishly, far too close to the front line. The CP, the command post, got hit by Japanese artillery fire, wounding all the leaders there, including Bernard Bartels from Bangor and a Bowdoin graduate, really just sort of decapitating the leadership in the entire battalion. This was sort of the last gasp of the Japanese. However, they finally, the 103rd and 152nd finally take Hill 600, where they had to fight off fanatical Japanese counterattacks. Many of these were with tanks. The Japanese actually did have one armored division. The big fear was that they were going to use this armored division to strike all these infantry units, and so they began attaching tanks, many of them Marine Corps tanks. This one's an Army tank. To the infantry in their operations. February finally brings a rest, where after 174 men have been killed in action and hundreds more wounded in action. And I will just go ahead and say here, where with the World War I presentation, I had really great numbers for casualties and how many people were in units and things like that. World War II is just very different because one, nobody did a great job after the war of documenting all this stuff and putting it into reports. And two, there was just a lot more privacy information than there was the First World War. Oops. Yes. All right. Will I be able to wrap up by 7:15? I think I can do that. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Suffice to say, fighting in Luzon goes on for a long time. These are arduous battles through the mountains. These are medics treating the wounded on the assault on Mount Tanawan, which was a 1,200 meter high eminence. Fighting through a lot of caves where the Japanese had barricaded themselves inside. The final operation of the 103rd and 152nd in World War II was the seizure of the Ipoh Dam, which is a really remarkable operation, a pincer or a full actual triple envelopment of this dam that was controlling 60% of Manila's water supply, Manila being the largest city in Luzon. This is massive operation aided by the Filipino guerrillas, which is a fascinating topic. If you have a chance, read up on the Filipino guerrillas. They were actually, a lot of them, members of the U.S. Armed Forces that had sort of scattered into the jungles to fight as guerrillas after the fall of the Philippines. Never really got the recognition they deserved. The operation to take Ipoh Dam was incredibly huge. 250,000 tons of napalm dropped, torrential rains through the mountains. Finally, the 103rd is able to link up with the Filipino guerrillas and seize the Ipoh Dam. This is the last operation for the troops in World War II. Here are some of the medics of the unit. I'm sorry. that's just a regular sergeant. That's one of the NCOs of the unit arriving in Japan. They arrive in Japan not in the way that they expect. They were expected to land as part of the invasion of the home islands of Japan. In fact, they were training for that on Luzon up until the point that the atomic bombs were dropped. They do go to Japan. They make target Tokyo as just an occupation force for 1 month. And then they are rotated home. Finally, on September 29th, they embark on ships, head back to San Francisco, arrive under the Golden Gate Bridge in October, and the units are inactivated and the soldiers sent home, many of them for the first time since February of 1941. And let me just go ahead and use the last few minutes to talk about a wild drive of the County Boys, the 203rd Field Artillery, through Europe. Meanwhile, back in France, the 203rd goes through training in the US in 1942 and 1943. They get sent to England in 1944, and they are not there for D-Day. They are going to land on D+16, so mid to late June. And they will land at Utah and Omaha beaches, so same place, wrong time. And almost immediately, there are trails down, guns firing, pretty much almost continuously until the end of the war. They're supporting the infantry initially, trying to break through German lines. They're part of the hedgerow fighting, firing against German artillery. Interesting, July 4th of 1944, every single gun in the army fired 1 round all at once at noon to celebrate Independence Day, just so everyone knew. They were routinely strafed by German aircraft, but that and enemy counterfire was the majority of their combat. Got to see Bob Hope. Everyone always includes one of those in their photo albums. I describe this to kids these days as, hey, imagine if Justin Timberlake came to see you. You know, not a hot young artist in their prime, but a well-seasoned one. These are great photos. There was an Italian who just attached themselves to the battalion. He had a accordion, taught the guys to play accordion. Of course, a sergeant is, I'm sure, playing it amazingly. He also taught them cribbage, which I'm wondering if they taught him cribbage, because that's an old Maine pastime. Through 1944, the battalion supported infantry assaults at strong points like Metz, pushing the Germans out of France, and then moved into Belgium, where they fired thousands of rounds at the siege of Aachen. And then in December of 1944, the Germans launched their massive counterattack, and you get the Battle of the Bulge. And so the battalion was moved south from Belgium down to the Rotgen Forest on the north end of the Bulge, north shoulder of the Bulge. And they were involved in this up until the very end of the fighting there. And I love this because, you know, you think of county guys, and here they are they've somehow found a cross-cut saw, and they've made themselves this great fighting position in the woods. And there's a great diary entry from Christmas Eve, 1944. If Jerry hung out his stocking, we filled it with high explosives that night. Finally, with the Bulge secure, they crossed the Rhine into Germany at the beginning of 1945. And by the end of the war, they were so mobile, they were practically up to the leading edge of their own tanks, able to drop their trails and render fire support from any position wherever needed. Crossed briefly into Holland, then Germany, and they were in the war up until the final minutes, and then served as part of the occupation force for a matter of months at the end of the war, firing more than 68,000 rounds at the enemy, equaling 3,200 tons of metal, and traveling 1,450 miles. Whew, okay. So I mentioned that I would take you from New Guinea to Belgium to Iceland. I didn't mention Iceland. So this is, and they don't get a picture because I can't find a picture of them. There was one extra company that I didn't mention, the Company C of the 118th Transportation Regiment. When the division changed in 1943, they became just the 142nd Quartermaster Truck Company and were sent to Iceland. And they spent their entire war in Iceland. I'm not exactly sure how that would look, but it was definitely different than everything that these other guys experienced. Except that Iceland was, until you look at Iceland being one of the largest logistic bases for operations in Europe at the time. So you had Mainers in Iceland as well. So as we said, I don't know the exact number of Maine Guard members who served in World War II, nor their exact losses. There were no really great records developed after the war, as there had been with World War I. We're still in the process of collecting a lot of this information, including the primary sources that really make this history more rich. A lot of veterans have done interviews and left behind things with their families and things like that. But the Guard came back home again. There's a great photo of the colors of all the regiments in front of the State House after the war. Many of the veterans stayed in, rising through the ranks, with some not really retiring until the 1970s after 30 years of service. And whether they protected the homeland, served in the Pacific, or Europe, Maine Guard soldiers undoubtedly left their mark on World War II. Whew, okay. I think that got us within our time limits. Thank you all for your patience through that. What must have been at some points bewildering, especially going through all the different pieces of the Pacific. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing right now. The Pacific campaign is a giant mess. It took me like a year to actually figure out what was going on there. But at this point, turn it over for Q&A.
Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. I think we could all maybe give whether a figurative or a real round of applause, whether our microphones are muted or not. And I think this is a really interesting counterpoint to your presentation on World War I. As Marilyn said in the introduction, I'm a bit of a World War II buff. I didn't serve in the military, but have extensive military in my family. Father, brother, and many relatives. And I am struck again in this presentation, as I've been struck many times before, in learning about World War II, simply about the scope. We say World War, and yet World War from perspective of the first to the second, the geographic scope and the reach, the places that these Maine soldiers went, the diversity of experience. You can't capture it in 1,000 presentations of this length, certainly not one. I'm also really struck by the humanity of the stories that you shared. These were, the phrase citizen soldier often comes up when we talk about troops in World War II. These were men and women who were often moved by the events of the day. So the bombing of Pearl Harbor certainly motivated people to join, but people joined ahead because they knew that war was coming. And they came from all walks of life, and they had to find a way to work together and to be a unit, and their survival depended on it. And I think it speaks very well of the US military and how we train our soldiers that they had the successes they did. Because in Japan, for example, soldiers were basically chattel. They were not considered independent thinking, acting members of their units. They were sacrificial in many instances. And yet the integrity of the American troop and their ability to think on their own, even when they've lost their military leaders, in the example that you gave, Jonathan, they can step up and make a difference. So I have a question I want to pose and then open it to the group for questions. One of my personal experiences was my uncle, who was an infantryman in the Pacific, and he served on Tarawa. We didn't know, he always walked with a limp, but he would never talk about it. And it was after he died that my cousin found the Purple Heart. And I've always felt a regret that I never asked the question, but I never knew to ask because he didn't want to share. And I've always been struck by how many soldiers from that era came back and didn't want to share about their experiences. And I wonder if you could comment on that from a historian's perspective.
Sure. It's very interesting going from World War I and World War II, kind of mentioning that comparing and contrasting of experiences. There's this weird point of up to about three to four, I would say even 5 years after World War I, soldiers were all too happy to talk about their experiences. They wrote about it, they talked about it, they sent letters to newspapers about it. It's one reason we have all these great primary sources. And then they stop, and the World War I generation sort of becomes the forgotten war, the silent generation, whatever you want to call it. World War II is also very similar. I mean, I can speak to it from, I think I had almost the same experience with my grandfather. Both grandfathers served in the war, and then that's my great uncle's helmet up there behind me next to the Lego X-wing. You can make evaluations as to my nerdiness as you will, but he was a field artillery battalion commander in the Pacific. But I only met one of my grandfathers, and he also refused. He just didn't talk about it. Didn't want to. And it wasn't until 2 weeks before he died that he opened up and told me life about, and what it was like to be an MP in Paris during the, in 1940, 1944, 45. Utterly unreal stories. I mean, the stuff that I was just sitting there and I just like turned on the recorder on my phone because I'm like, oh my gosh, not only is this great for family history, but as a historian, I'm going, this is yet another piece because of being a military policeman in Paris means you see all the bad things that the army is doing or the bad things that the soldiers are doing. And that is also a piece of army history. So that was fascinating. But to the larger point of people's voices, veterans' voices after war, it was interesting that my other grandfather, who saw arguably a lot more war, being a engineer battalion PA, he was basically a doctor for an engineer battalion, an African-American engineer battalion too. So he had quite an experience through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Apparently never shut up about the war. And then so my mom was always like, well, my dad never talks about it, and David's dad never shuts up about it. So you kind of had some people who really like to relive that experience. For veterans from the Maine Guard in World War World War II, there are not many interviews. I'm able to collect some. Most of them are not Mainers. A lot of them are those who were drafted into the regiment or came in as volunteers to the regiments during the war, and they're fascinating. Some of them are there's one book by a guy who's just very like, he's leaning into this whole like, I'm a warrior fighting with gusto for America. There's this one phenomenal interview with a medic who is just one of the most humble individuals, and who highlights this episode where they're on a patrol and they capture some Japanese, and the guys are like, it's too much trouble to bring them back, we need to shoot them. And he goes, whoa, 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 whoa. We don't do that. And they said, no, it's just too much of a pain in the butt. And he said, no, we're Americans. What if we're not fighting for something? Why are we here? And so from a simple one person at camp, I mean, just a very humble guy, you can kind of see in the narrative of the transcription that he's sort of unloading a lot of this, and as almost a cathartic episode. It sounds like he hadn't really shared it with anybody else. That tends to be more the norm, where if you get someone to open up, it is sort of the, you are lifting a burden. And then interestingly, my own generation also doesn't shut up. We air everything. We like to talk about our war experiences. We write about it. And so from a historical perspective, I'm like, well, thank goodness that people are out here documenting experiences, because we don't have letters anymore, unless people are saving their emails or their Facebook messages or DMs or anything like that. So it's a whole new venue. So unfortunately, when you have to view someone's sort of angry veteran rant from their truck cab about something that they don't like, you actually have to be like, all right, well, there's a piece of history, because maybe there's something historical in here, even though it's irritating. But I think it is an interesting way to look at how generations view conflict and view their own participation in how comfortable they are in sharing that with everybody, because it is a piece of themselves.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So other folks in the room, questions or comments? Jump right in.
No, thank you. I wish that I had not missed the previous one, and I certainly don't want to miss the next one, but I'm especially glad I saw this one. I just started building my military library about 2 years ago when I read the book Iwo Jima. I found an original old paperback copy at the VA, and I was just absolutely fascinated with the book. It was riveting to read it, especially since it was written by people who were actually there, 5 different people. So you had that melding. And I was really struck by how when they talked about people, they didn't just talk about the soldiers, they actually named them and where they were from, like Lieutenant John Smith from, Cleveland, Ohio, and did this as in the civilian life. So it was really fascinating to me. And I was fortunate enough last year at a creative art show they sat a gentleman next to me who was on Iwo Jima.
Oh, wow.
And he came and gave a speech for us. Yes. And I wish I had the notes with me with his name and everything. And I had wanted to interview him and do what you're doing, start doing that specifically on that particular campaign. And then COVID hit and everything kind of shut down. But I think this is wonderful that you're doing this. I think we lose so much with history. Especially right now in the world the way it is, it's like we've kind of started to think that history has a bad name. And I just think it's not always pretty. Sometimes it's ugly, especially when you're talking about war. But it gives you such a different understanding, especially of the military, when you learn about these things and what it was like. And I'm from Maine, so for me, that's even more. I'm in New York right now, but I think it's wonderful.
The point you brought up about where they emphasize the individual in their hometown. I mean, it's such a big piece. And there was one story that I forgot I wanted to share, sort of indicative of something you were saying, Tom, about normal people doing extraordinary things. The first sergeant for the company from Gardner, Company F of the 103rd, was named Walt Pottle. He was a clerk, a grocery store clerk from in Randolph, Maine, and it's company first sergeant, senior non-commissioned officer, the guy who upholds the standards and takes care of beans and bullets, as we say, making sure everyone's fed and has everything they need. And he turned out to be, war was what he was really good at. I don't know how good he was as a clerk, but he was really good at war. And to the point of he would just not accept no for an answer if troops were ever in danger. He sort of formed up a scratch team of clerks and cooks and led a party out to rescue some troops who were under fire on Hill 600 on Mount Tanawan. He himself went up and with a whole bunch of supplies and brought up food and water for troops who were pinned down. And he was out with his troops. They were doing a cave clearing operation, and he was walking point. And he walked into this tunnel complex, and he either tripped something like a booby trap, something happened. He immediately rushed out and pushed the 2 guys who were behind him back from the entrance of the tunnel. And as he did so, the entire tunnel blew up. He obviously hit a booby trap, throwing his body basically out into the jungle. I don't believe, I haven't been able to find that it was ever recovered. But in doing so, he saved the lives of the men that he was with. I've only ever found this recounted in one really obscure sort of thing that was written down by some members of the company after the war. It was not something that was published widely. And yet this is a guy who sacrificed himself for his soldiers. And then that was it. And so I think it's really important that we look at this for the war from a really personal level, especially as the World War II generation begins to disappear, or continues to disappear, I should say. And then gathering interviews where possible. Like I said, last year, I got the great news that a veteran of Company D of the 103rd wanted to was still around and was willing to talk to me. So I went to his house and I brought him, a letter from the adjutant general and pictures of his company that I had, and as everything is possible. And then he just started talking, and I was just sort of, in seventh heaven there. And he was just telling me all these things and how he knew this person and he saw this thing, and Louisiana was horrible. I'm like, yes, I was in Louisiana in the exact same spot earlier this year. It is horrible. So nothing changed. But he actually thought it was funny. He's like, so wait, he's like, you've been to Camp Shelby, you've been to Louisiana, you've been to Fortress. So you guys are still training in the same places 75 years later. We haven't learned anything, have you? I'm like, all right, well, when you put it that way, sir. But yeah, making the war personal is just so important. It's the way that we also, as humans, we like stories. And so transmitting the information in that way is way better than just a lot of facts and figures. And here's a map and where things go around.
Jonathan, you just got a couple of minutes left. How about some reflections on your experiences in Washington, D.C. with our men and women of the Maine National Guard?
Sure. Yeah, that was a weird one. That was an unexpected one. I got what was it? January 13th. I found out that I was going to get tapped to we activated 2 companies to go to DC. We talked about the National Guard being always ready, always there. Oh boy, 48 hours later, we're literally on a plane, on a KC-135 refueling aircraft from the Maine Air National Guard. Literally cleared their stuff out of the way, threw all of our stuff inside. It was awesome. The air crew was fantastic to work with. But I mean, we called everyone to the armories, issued weapons, equipment, went through a snap review of records and everything like that, and all the stuff you have to do prior to a deployment. Loaded up on planes, flew down there, got on ground. 25,000 Guard troops in DC. What that looks like is unreal. It really is incredible. Capitol Hill, where we were posted, looked like the green zone in Iraq, or like Baghdad or Kabul. Checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint. It was unreal just to even get inside. And we were uniformed and had security badges and everything. Just to even get inside the perimeter, you had to just go through this labyrinth. It was crazy. I remember the first night that we went on duty, we pulled 24-hour shifts at the Library of Congress. Yes, it was very weird. We were guarding the Library of Congress. So we stood outside with weapons, body armor, the whole deal. I remember just standing there looking across Capitol Hill, completely empty of anybody except for troops. And all my soldiers going, sir, this is completely surreal. And I'm like, yes, it is. This is something that hopefully they will never see again in their lives. It was thankfully uneventful. I am of the firm belief that if it were not for the Guard deployment, there would have been people who were trying to do things. Anybody who would try to do anything at that point when we were all there would have just been suicidal. There were 1 or 2 individuals who tried to do stupid things. They were immediately identified by Secret Service, Metro Police, the Capitol Police, etc. So from a commander standpoint, it was nonstop, very little sleep, go, go, go. They housed us in the Watergate Hotel. So that was nice. Yeah, the Watergate. Yep, that's the one with good old Nixon. So I can now say I've had a pizza party with my troops in the basement of the Watergate Hotel. From a commander's standpoint, I think I got even more gray hairs and I need more sleep. From a historical standpoint, holy cow, just utterly unreal to see this type of thing. And then to see the unbelievable cooperation between all the agencies and all the different units and everything like that were down there. I mean, so much understanding and everyone just sort of rallying together, knowing, hey, this is an unprecedented time. This is crazy. None of us know what we're doing. Let's just be calm and help each other out as much as we can. We did get 1 day to go sort of after we came off mission. We got to go around the mall. And so I sort of gave a little history tour to some of my troops around the mall. We re-enlisted some people were re-enlisting. So we did their oath of re-enlistment we had one at the World War II monument, at the main piece of the World War II monument, one at the Korean, and then one at the Lincoln Memorial. So really meaningful for a lot of those soldiers. And I think meaningful overall for all of them. The last day that we were there, Susan Collins stopped by and she gave a blow by blow that was amazing of what it was like to be in the Capitol on January 6th. And that really cemented home for the soldiers sort of why they were there, the overall why of the mission. So I was very grateful that that happened. But I don't know, hope it never happens again, but it was definitely one of those things that I was honored to do for Maine. Yeah, I think hopefully that's the last of it. I did tell my soldiers the last time that our company was there in that role was 1861 as Company H of the 1st Maine Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Interestingly, we were camped only 30 blocks away. The food was so bad that the soldiers decided to go to the nearest person that they could think of who had good food, who was the president. So they went to the White House kitchen to demand better provisions, and they got it from the cook. So luckily, no one tried that this time. We had good pizza delivery.